Well, good morning and welcome to this evidential hearing in the Sheco Bio public inquiry. Before we begin to hear evidence, there are certain matters which I wish to mention. Core participants and members of the public will be aware that I appointed a procedural hearing for Wednesday, 16 November 2022, and subsequently cancelled it. I wish to explain why I took these steps. On 8 November, the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Scotland, who is a core participant, lodged a written application moving me to postpone until a later hearing the evidence of certain witnesses who were due to give evidence in the hearing starting today. I carefully considered the application. I had regard to a number of considerations, including the extent of the evidence subject to the motion to postpone, the importance of that evidence to the inquiry, the reasons advanced for postponement, the impact of postponement on this hearing, its impact on subsequent hearings of the inquiry, and the proximity to this hearing. I concluded that the matter was of such significance that it should be dealt with at a procedural hearing at which I could hear arguments for and against postponement. I directed that the application should be circulated to other core participants in anticipation of the procedural hearing. In the event, in the course of the week before the hearing, Senior Counsel for the Chief Constable approached Senior Counsel to the inquiry, and they engaged in fruitful discussions. Senior Counsel for the Chief Constable then indicated that as a result of these discussions, they were reassured to the extent that postponement of the evidence was not necessary. The Chief Constable's application would be withdrawn. I think that it is unfortunate that that approach by Senior Counsel for the Chief Constable was not made before the decision was made to lodge the application. Had it been, the issues could have been resolved, rendering the lodging of the application, consideration of it, and the making of the necessary arrangements to hold a procedural hearing unnecessary. I would encourage the legal representatives of core participants to raise such issues in first instance with counsel to the inquiry and the inquiry's legal team. Only if such discussion does not bear fruit should it be necessary for an application to be made seeking a ruling by me. It is also important to bear in mind that this is an inquisitorial and investigative inquiry. It is of a rolling nature and involves an iterative process. As the terms of reference are extensive, it is necessary for me to break the hearings into blocks. But these blocks are not hermetically sealed, and there will be a degree of overlap. Issues may be revisited. So, for example, in this hearing, aspects of training, as it was conducted in May 2015, will be the subject of evidence. At a later hearing, I would anticipate evidence of a comparative exercise between training as it was in 2015 and training as currently provided. Another aspect of the rolling approach is that it would be premature to form any concluded views on the evidence at this stage. I now want to say a little about the timetable of the inquiry. The inquiry was set up in November 2020, on the 30th of November. Only then could I begin to ingather the evidence, and as it became available in the course of 2021, start considering it. The first hearing was held in May and June 2020 and focused on the events in Hayfield Road on 3 May 2015, leading up to the death of Sheku Bayo. In the hearing beginning today, in addition to evidence relating to training, which I have already mentioned, the inquiry will hear evidence in relation to police command and control on the 3rd of May 2015, expert evidence in relation to the options open to various officers in the stages leading up to and including the events in Hayfield Road, certain forensic evidence, and the final report prepared by advanced laser imaging. Looking forward, I anticipate that there will be a series of hearings in the course of 2023 and into the early part of 2024. On 31 January 2023, I intend to convene a hearing on evidence relating to the post-incident management by officers of Police Scotland. That will be followed by a hearing on cause of death. At that point, I shall invite closing submissions in relation to the events on 3 May 2015. The inquiry will then go on to hold hearings in relation to the investigations conducted by the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner and the Lord Advocate. There will be further hearings in relation to training and certain other matters. While the issue of race will continue to be examined in the course of each of the hearings, I expect to hold a dedicated hearing on the issue of race in the concluding stages of the oral hearings. I consider that the timetable which I have outlined is necessary in order to conduct the kind of full and thorough inquiry to which I committed myself at the outset. I do not think that the extensive terms of reference could be fully explored in any lesser timescale. I want now to turn to another matter. It has come to my attention that core participants in this inquiry have been subject to abuse on social media or in writing. I abhor such abuse, whatever its source, and against whomever it is directed. Recently, it has been reported to me that the family of Sheku Bayo and their solicitor have been subjected to racist abuse. I am sure that everyone associated with this inquiry will agree with me that such behaviour is despicable and entirely unacceptable. In some instances, it may amount to hate crime. In every instance, it causes the recipients and members of their family, some of whom may be quite young, pain, distress, and harm. The families of Sheikh Ubayo remain at the heart of this inquiry. The inquiry strongly condemns such treatment of them and calls for it to cease. I'm now going to adjourn briefly in order that the first witness can be settled in. Now, Inspector Young, good morning. I understand that you will take an affirmation.
Yes, sir.
Would you say the words of the affirmation after me, please? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Greer.
Thank you. Good morning, Inspector Young.
Morning.
What is your full name?
James John Young.
Thank you. What age are you?
I'm 53.
And your rank is Inspector.
That's correct.
How many years service do you have?
27.
And your current role?
I am the operational lead for the National Taser Programme.
Thank you. You will see in front of you that there's a blue folder, and this contains hard copies of a number of documents. I'm going to go through them with you. But please feel free to look at it, use it. If you'd like me to refer to something, we'll be able to bring it up on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
As we go through these, I will bring them up on the screen in front of you. But if there's anything that you think is significant and you'd like to look at, we can do that as well.
Thank you.
Would you look, please, first of all, at PERC 00388. This is a statement dated the 14th of September 2015. So it should be at the beginning of your folder, and you'll also see it's come up on the screen. And we're on page 1, and it gives your name, and it says the statement was taken 14th September 2015, 10:55, by DSI Keith Harrower at Coatbridge Police Office in the presence of investigator Alexander Maguire. And if we look at page 2 of this statement, thank you. It refers to, can we just go up slightly, please? It says label number, which is a document, probation or training officer safety training course manual. And am I correct in saying this was a statement taken by PERC from you, where you provided them with a copy of an officer safety training manual?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And you did your best to tell them the truth about these matters and to be accurate in everything you
Yes.
said. And was that the position with all of the statements you gave to PERC?
Yes.
You've said in your inquiry statement, which I'll come to in a moment, that your memory of matters in any of your statements when they were given, so in 2015, for example, was clearer at the time of giving the statements than it is now.
Yes.
And that's because you said of the passage of time.
That's correct.
And that's correct in relation to any older statements that you've given.
Yes.
Can I ask you to look, please, at PERC statement 0389, please? And this is a later statement. The date is the 11th of December 2017, and it was taken at Scottish Police College, Jackton, by DSI William Little, Billy Little. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And it was also, if we move down the screen slightly, you'll see it was in the presence of a temporary investigator, Ashley Leach. And again, you were doing your best to provide PERC with the information they sought.
Yes.
And then can we look at PERC statement 00390? And this is the statement from the 12th of January 2018, taken by temporary investigating officer Ashley Leach, again at Jackton, and in the presence of DSI Little.
Yes, correct.
And in this statement at page 2, if we can move to page 2, paragraph 3, it says here, I came into post as National Officer Safety Coordinator in September 2014 and became the National Lead for Officer Safety Training in October 2016. And actually that relates to your involvement with PERC in this matter your responsibilities in relation to training in Police Scotland.
That's correct, yes.
And at paragraph 3, you also mention that, as we read through this paragraph, that you refer to the manual, the Officer Safety Training Manual dated September 2013, and you say this was the manual that was in place when I came into post, and must clarify that I cannot comment on this as I had no involvement in its formulation. And as I am aware, this is the only document that was in existence at the time of me taking up this post. I can also say this is the document used as the Officer Safety Training Course Manual at the material time of the 3rd of May 2015. So you referred to the 2013 manual. That was the one that was in force when you came into post, dealing with training for Police Scotland.
Yes.
And it was the one that was in force on the 3rd of May 2015.
Yes.
Who has access to that manual?
So that manual is provided to all probationary officers on commencement of their training at Scottish Police College at Tullyallen. And that is the core reference document for the Probationary Training Officer Safety Training Programme. And so they will have, obviously, all probationers get access to that, as well all the officer safety instructors at Tullyallen, and all the officer safety instructors throughout the force areas also.
So for anyone who was a probationer from 2013, when this manual came into force, until 2015, they would have had a copy of that 2013 manual
Yes.
given to them when they were probationers.
Yes.
What about versions that existed prior to 2013 for officers who are maybe more experienced?
The manual, as far as I'm concerned, I'm aware the manual has, I suppose, morphed over the years in a number of different versions. From Scottish Police College manuals, we also had Legacy Force manuals. So there were a number of different manuals in existence, and different versions in existence.
With different officers?
Yes.
Now, you've used the word legacy, or legacy force. So we know that Police Scotland came into existence on the 1st of April 2013.
Yes.
When you refer to legacy forces, what is it you mean?
So the forces that made up Police Scotland with the formation of Police Scotland. So the previous local forces.
So prior to April 2013, we had Fife Constabulary,
Yes.
Lothian and Borders.
That's correct.
So it was the different areas in Scotland, and they all amalgamated and became Police
That's
Scotland.
correct.
And that was 1st of April 2013. And it was after, I think you said here, September 2013, that this particular manual became the Officer Safety Training Manual.
Yes.
Thank you. So if there is, just to be clear before I leave these PERC statements, if there's any discrepancy between what you've said today or what you say in your inquiry statement, which we'll come to in a moment, could you advise the Chair, should he prefer your original statements or should he prefer your evidence today?
I will obviously do my very best to remember what I said in my statements. I probably, my preference is what I said today.
All right, thank you. And just to be clear for anyone listening, you weren't at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May 2015.
No, I
That's
wasn't.
not your involvement in
No.
this matter.
No.
Thank you. And really what we're interested in relation to your evidence is to hear about your training experience and your involvement, primarily since you came into this role in September 2014.
Yes.
The National Officer Safety Coordinator.
That's correct.
Thank you. Let's look at your inquiry statement, please. SBPI 00153. And you'll see on the screen, and you have a copy in front of you, that this is the inquiry statement that was taken from you by the inquiry team over Teams on the 21st of March this year. And you have, it's not shown on the screen, but on your hard copy, you should see that you've signed it on every page.
That's correct.
Thank you. And can we look at the final page, please? And you'll see that the date you signed it was the 20th of June. Oh, there it is, 20th of June this year. And if we look at paragraph 88, which is the final paragraph, it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And that remains the position today.
Yes.
So you understand that your full statement will be published later on our website for anyone who wishes to read it.
Yes.
And the whole statement is available for the chair to consider.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we look, please, at paragraph 4 of your inquiry statement? And this relates to officer safety training experience. That's your own experience. And it says you've been involved in officer safety training, or OST for short, since 2012. And you became the national OST instructor in 2012 while you were working as a police sergeant at Tullyallen. And then in October 2013, you took over responsibility for the coordination of OST at Tullyallen. And you were responsible for that at the Scottish Police College. So this is prior to your move in 2014. Can you tell the chair a little bit about your experience during this period?
Yes, so in November 2012, I undertook the 2-week National OST Instructors course. I thereafter delivered OST training on a part-time basis to the probationers at Tullyallen during their OST training blocks. I continued that until around about October 2013. With a change of role, I took over the responsibility for the OST coordination at Tullyallen. That entailed mainly ensuring that there was adequate resources, venues in place to ensure that the training ran smoothly and was able to be delivered as per the timetable. I took over management responsibility for the officer safety training instructors, and so any issues or any resourcing issues, they would come to me to try and manage. I also had a number of other responsibilities at that time. It wasn't just for OST. And during that time, I became involved in the national, I suppose, management of OST. And that was not just the management of the probationer training course delivered at Tullyallen, but also the annual refresher courses that were delivered to operational officers throughout the country. During that time, I took a keen interest in the content of the programme. Although I had no, I suppose, overview or management responsibility in relation to the programme, at that time that was the chief inspectors and superintendents for leadership training and development at Tullyallen that had that overall management responsibility. So in September 2014, I then moved down to Jackton, where my primary role was that of the National Officer Safety Training Coordinator.
Before we move on to that, can I just ask you some questions about the position in 2013?
Yes.
We've heard it became Police Scotland in April that year. So by, I think you say, was it October, you were the coordinator at Tullyallen, and was it the 2013 manual that was in place at that time?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And that was for all the new probationers?
Yes.
And the chair probably knows this, but they will have an intensive period of training at Tullyallen.
Yes.
For a number of weeks.
That's correct.
And you were not responsible at that time, however, for the existing qualified, if I can say, police officers who would be doing annual recertification training.
No, I wasn't.
So that wasn't initially part of your role.
That's correct.
And then in September 2014, you've moved to the role of National Officer Safety Training Coordinator.
Yes.
And that then became your role, that not only were you in charge of probationer training at Tullyallen, but then the recertification annual training became your job as well.
That's correct.
So from September 2014, you're dealing with it on a national level. That's effectively for all police officers under the grade of...
All police officers up to the rank of Chief Constable,
Right.
and also relevant police staff.
So not only probationers and officers, but staff also,
Yes, some
and
staff.
the Chief Constable.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask you anything about training the Chief Constable. Right, September 2014 you take on that role, and then 2015 you qualify also as a first aid instructor. And so until that point, your training didn't include, or the training you delivered didn't include first aid training. Is that right?
No, it didn't, no.
Right. But from that, you then become qualified to give training in first aid.
Yes.
And then in October 2016, you were promoted to temporary inspector as the head of officer safety training. Can you explain to the chair what the distinction there is between the national officer safety training coordinator and the head of officer safety training?
Yes. So the coordination and responsibility for the programme, it lay with the head of training, but that was devolved down to the chief inspector, and then each inspector within the training department had an area of responsibility, and the inspector at the Police Scotland College at Jackton had the responsibility for officer safety training at the inspector level. So when I was the OST coordinator at sergeant level, I reported to an inspector.
Right.
That inspector wasn't an officer safety instructor or had any training in officer safety, and therefore a lot of the responsibility lay to myself as a sergeant. When I was temporarily promoted, I took on the role as head of officer safety training, although I was still answerable to the chief inspector and superintendent.
But once you received that, at that stage, temporary promotion,
Yes.
you could then take on that head of officer safety training role.
Yes.
So prior to that, you'd been a sergeant,
Yes.
but then the promotion allowed you to take on that full title.
Yes.
And then you say you also took on the role of taser as well, which you've told us is your current role.
That's correct.
And you did joint roles up until March 2020. So was that the head of officer safety training plus the taser responsibilities?
That's correct. I was head of officer safety training and the operational lead for the initial taser uplift programme.
But they're now separate roles, are they?
Yes.
So up until 2020, it sounds like you were doing everything on the training.
As regard to officer safety training and taser, then yes.
Yeah. And then from March of 2020, so that would be just about lockdown, effectively, you stopped your head of officer safety training role and you moved on to full-time taser work.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look now just briefly at paragraph 26? This is a paragraph headed National Review of Officer Safety Training. And you say when you became the National OST Coordinator, I undertook a full national review of OST provision across the country. And this commenced on the 1st of December 2014. So this is when you're National Officer Safety Training Coordinator.
Yes.
We need to find a shorter acronym for that one. But that's when you're in the national role.
Yes, correct.
So you're doing the probationer and the qualified police officers and staff.
Yes.
And you say you undertook a review. Could you tell the chair a little about the review that you did?
So as I say, I'd been involved in, even though I wasn't, I suppose, officially the National OST Coordinator at that time, when I was the OST Coordinator at Tullyallen, I was involved with the Legacy Force representatives through regular meetings, so I became involved in the national programme, the training that was delivered to officers out with Tullyallen. And I observed a number of I suppose, of challenges or issues that identified with regards to the provision of OST across the country. And therefore I sought approval to undertake a review to identify what these challenges were and how we could resolve and mitigate the issues that we'd identified.
I'll come on to those challenges and ask you about those later, but I think you've said that your review commenced in December of 2014 and then it concluded in March of 2015. And there were, if we carry on down the page slightly, we'll see that you made 28 recommendations and all were approved and formed part of the new OST training programme. But that commenced in August 2016. So it took a period of time to do the review, conclude what your recommendations would be, and then to implement a new programme, having devised that programme.
That's correct.
Right. And that work was completed by August 2016.
Yes.
And you say here this review was mainly about standardisation of processes and procedures, and you looked at delivery of training, and you looked at mental health and acute behavioural disorder, and thought those areas could be improved.
Amongst other areas, yes.
And other areas. I'm interested in what you say here about standardisation of processes and procedures. Why was that something that you were aiming for? What was the position until you did your review?
So even after the formation of Police Scotland, as far as OST or officer safety training was concerned, the legacy forces, if we can call them that, were still following their own legacy force procedures, policies. There was a disparity in processes. There was disparity in record keeping and auditing, quality assurance. So as a national force, our officers and the public deserved national standardised processes. We needed to ensure that we had the same training and processes from the north to south to the east to the west of the country.
We'll come back to that in a moment. You do detail this later. Can I just check with you, coming back to the 2013 manual, did that remain in force until August 2016? During the period you're doing the review?
Yes, we had to, I suppose, have a holding position or a status quo as such. So that holding position was that we would refer to that manual as the core reference document until that new manual could be produced and that programme implemented.
So for any officer who was doing their probationary training in that period from 2013 up to 2016, it would still remain the 2013 manual that would be used to train them?
Yes.
Thank you. We've heard evidence that some of the officers involved in events in Hayfield Road were probationers in 2015, so they would have been trained in relation to the 2013 manual.
Yes, they would be, yes.
But for any officers who were trained prior to 2013, so were probationers maybe 7 years before then or 20 years before then, they would have had different materials from which they were trained.
Yes.
But those officers would have had annual recertification training.
Depending on what force they came, because I do know that some forces had possibly biannual.
Right.
They would have had some sort of refresher training, yes.
But it was particular to their legacy force, whether that be Fife or Lothian and Borders or some other area.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And between 2013 and 2015, was the recertification annual during those years? So the years that you were involved?
With the formation of Police Scotland, a decision was made that it would go to annual recertification, yes.
So from the 1st of April 2013, across Scotland, officers were getting annual recertification.
That's correct.
And tell me if I'm wrong, was that a one-day training course?
Yes.
Thank you. And did you have a say or involvement in the nature of that training, that recertification training, or the content of that training?
Not at that time, not until the new programme was introduced in 2016.
So who was providing that annual recertification training between 2013 and 2015?
So the training model depended on the legacy force area. If you were in the old Strathclyde area, then that training was delivered by a full-time OST team, managed by a sergeant. If you were in any of the other forces or legacy forces or divisions, then the OST was delivered by part-time divisional officers who came in and delivered OST as and when required, and each division had its own, I suppose, governance procedures in place.
Are you able to help us today with working out, I'm wondering how much control you had over whether training at this recertification was done in relation to the 2013 manual or some other legacy force documents?
So when I carried out the review, I contacted, I suppose, the Officer Safety Training representative from each of the legacy force areas. I conducted a number of focus groups. I spoke to instructors, I spoke to students and officers. And what I suppose discovered was that the course source reference document that each of the divisions said that they used was the 2013 manual. But I subsequently, at the same time, I discovered that there was a number of other source documents being used. There was some legacy force documents being used. There was outdated, I suppose, or older versions of the 2013 manual. We still had, I suppose, legacy force documents. We had instructors who didn't use any manual at all. So it was disparate.
Right. Let's look at the 2013 version of the OST manual. So the copy I've been working on, Miss Wildgoose, is PS 11538A. So this, if we go down to the bottom of page 1 of this, you can see this particular version was last amended 8th of October 2013.
That's correct.
And if we could maybe, this is module 1, could we maybe look at page 5? And you'll see at the, right, we won't get the entire page on the screen, but you can see page 5 relates module 1, use of force, Police Scotland policy. There we are, and we can see the 5 on the bottom right hand corner of that page. And we'll just show half of that even, just because it's quite small print. And you'll see that this is the 2013 manual, and it relates to use of force. So this is the base material that would normally provide a source document between 2013 and 15 in relation to use of force. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you recognise
Yes.
this
Yes.
page? And towards the bottom of that page, we can see there's a reference to officers confronted with the same set of circumstances may react differently. They may select different force options, each of which they perceive to be appropriate and reasonable for them. And it is for each officer to justify their individual course of action, and the Police Scotland National Decision Model should be considered at all times. So I'm interested in this paragraph for the moment, if you don't mind. So this suggests that am I correct to say there's not always one option? There's not one option. Two officers can take different courses of action in relation to the use of force.
That's correct.
And am I right in saying that the manual doesn't prohibit use of force? Doesn't say to police officers, you're not allowed to use force
No.
in a set of circumstances?
No, it doesn't.
So it's very much at the discretion of the individual.
But yes, we provide a framework to the officers and it's their discretion, yes.
And the sort of caveat to that, or the condition that has to be complied with, is that it has to be justified. And can you explain what that means?
So any use of force, the officer must be able to justify their actions. And there is a number of different ways that can be done.
And can you explain why it has to be justified?
Because if a police officer's use of force is not justified, then it could be an offence has been committed.
And I'm interested in the reference there to the National Decision Model. Now, we've heard some evidence about this. This is the 2013 manual. Was the National Decision Model being used by officers at this time?
It was in the manual. I don't recall it ever being taught.
But it was in the manual.
It was in the manual, but as I say, as far as an OST context, I don't recall it ever being taught.
So can you explain why would it be referred to in the manual but not be taught in officer safety training?
That's one of the conundrums that I identified when I took over. I couldn't tell you why. I don't know. As I say, this manual was in place before I came in, and it's one of the issues that I addressed later.
What was taught if it wasn't the National Decision Model?
So we had a number of, or mainly two, use of force models, if you want to call them that. The first one was what's known as the confrontational continuum, and the second was what we called the conflict resolution model.
Tell us about the confrontational continuum, please.
So the confrontational continuum is a use of force model. It's been in existence for as long as I ever remember. And basically it correlates a subject's behaviour to what would be an appropriate tactical option for the police.
Can you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, of course. So if you think about it, it's like it looks like a graph. You have an X and a Y axis, and down the vertical axis you would have what's known as the officer response options, and then on the horizontal axis you would have the subject actions, and this model would directly correlate a tactical option to a subject's behaviour. And it gave the officers a guide of, when they identified the subject's behaviour, they could then correlate that back to what an appropriate tactical option would be given the circumstances.
And the conflict resolution model, what was that?
So the conflict resolution model basically showed officers the relationship between the reasonable officer response options, or the tactical options, the profiled offender behaviour of the subject, and how impact factors could you be used to inform an officer's use of force.
All right. I'm going to refer you to the use of force SOP in a moment, but let's have a look at, before we move there, paragraph 34 of your inquiry statement, please. And I think here you talk about the 36-hour initial training programme that's for probationers, presumably.
Yes.
And there was a 3-hour theory input, and a PowerPoint presentation was used as part of the theory input. So this is in 2014-2015.
Yes.
And the PowerPoint's in addition to the manual.
Yes, it's used to, in a lecture style environment, teach elements of the manual, yes.
And then if we can move down, it says this covered a variety of topics, including use of force, impact factors, various other parts of what we called OST theory, such as use of force legislation, conflict resolution models, etc. And that's what you've just been mentioning, conflict resolution models.
Yes.
And you mentioned there was a small part of it where positional asphyxia was covered in some slides. It informed officers what it was and what can cause it, and the risk factors which contribute to the condition. And this was things like body position, drugs and alcohol, inability to escape, especially if they're in the prone position. So can I ask you, the PowerPoint that was used, was that based on information that was in the 2013 manual?
Yes.
Can I ask you, I haven't asked you this previously, were special constables incorporated in part of your role in 2014-2015?
Special constables received the same officer safety training as conventional constables, yes.
So it was probationers, qualified officers, staff, and the special
Yes.
constables as well. Thank you. All right, could we look at paragraph 14 of your statement, please? You say that you knew there was an instructor's manual from 2012. So this paragraph is OST instructor's manual. So this is another manual separate from the one that's used for probationers,
Yes.
the sort of student police officer
Yes.
probationer. And you knew there was another manual, an instructor's manual from 2012, but when you took over as coordinator, you weren't aware of the provenance of that manual, where it came from, and that was also causing some...
To teach, and I suppose additional information that an instructor would need to know, that students wouldn't need to know. There was elements of the instructor's manual that, as I say, I wasn't happy with their provenance. I wasn't happy with their accuracy. And there was certain elements about certain techniques that were contained in the instructor's manual that to me contradicted what was in the student manual. So to ensure that only one version of the truth, if you will, was being taught, then I removed the instructor manual and made the core reference document the student manual. And then when they brought the new programme in 2016, we supplemented the new student manual with trainer guides, etc. Nothing that would directly contradict what was in the manual.
Right. So you said some of the techniques contradicted
Yes.
what was in the student manual, the
Yes.
2013 manual. Do you remember which techniques those were?
So the issue I had was the significant reference to what we call distraction techniques. So there was no reference to distraction techniques within the student manual, but there was a significant part of that in the instructor manual. When I did the review, there was significant confusion in my mind, and there also in the officers' minds around about what an actual distraction technique was.
Can you help me with that?
Yes, so a distraction technique, and it's an approved technique with used in England and Wales, is basically normally a strike that's delivered to an area of the body that causes an overwhelming sense of pain or a muscular dysfunction, which will allow that officer then to gain control of a resistant subject.
Can you give us an example?
So, for instance, if an officer or two officers were trying to put someone into an arm lock and take control of their arms, and that person was resisting, and the officers were unable to do that, then in the instructor's manual it said that you could deliver what is known as distraction techniques, which would be a strike to the muscular areas of the arms, and that would then allow the officer to take control of that arm, because it distracts the subject away from the resistance. My view is that a distraction is still a strike. So we had what was known as we had strikes in the programme, and then we had distractions. And when I spoke to officers, they basically were of the opinion that a distraction was different to a strike and required, less justification, which is not the case.
Right.
So that was the main issue I had with the instructor's manual, is that a strike is a strike and had to be justified as such.
So that was causing some confusion.
Yes.
And you, in your work, streamlined all of that, tried to minimise the confusion, areas where confusion arose, and turned it into the one manual in 2016.
That's correct, yes.
But in the 2013 student manual, they didn't have these distraction techniques.
No, it wasn't mentioned.
So there was more in the instructor's manual than there had been in the student manual.
Yes.
But the instructor's manual went to those who were being taught to be instructors.
That's correct.
Not to just
To students.
a normally qualified officer.
That's correct.
And you've also said you were concerned about the provenance of some things. Do you remember what that related to?
That mainly was in relation to the medical implications section. Obviously, as an instructor, they will be asked questions, or potentially be asked questions by students. So there was, I suppose, more information in the instructor's manual that the students would receive, but it gave the instructor more information in case questions were asked. There's a significant section in the instructor's manual on medical implications, but I couldn't find where this came from. There was no clinical governance around about it. I couldn't see any evidence of a medical professional having looked at this medical implications section and saying that it was medically correct.
And that was a concern for you?
Yes, because we may have been teaching something that was wrong or hadn't been governed, yes.
Right. And did you rectify that when you introduced the new 2016 manual?
Yes, I instigated a clinical governance group, and we got a recognised medical professional to clinically govern the medical implications aspect of the new programme, yes.
So that became the 2016 manual, which you revised.
Yes.
That. Were there any specific sections that you had the medical professional review that were then altered in the 2016 version?
Yes, there was obviously the medical implications section. There was the section on acute behavioural disturbance. And yeah, so that's, and then we got them to review our techniques that we trained and to make sure that we had covered the medical implications of these techniques in the manual.
When you say the techniques, do you mean the strikes that officers might adopt?
Strikes, holds.
And the impact that would have
That's
on
correct,
the
yes.
subject?
Yes.
And in relation to ABD, acute behavioural disorder, as you say, Were there specific changes that were made by your medical professional?
So I had liaised with the College of Police in England. I think it was in 2015. I obviously became aware of, I suppose, the change away from using the term excited delirium to the introduction of the term of ABD. I was sitting on the UK National Practitioners Group at that time when we became aware of this ongoing change. I sought approval from the College of Policing to use their training on ABD, which I then incorporated that into a mandatory training package for Police Scotland and also into the manual. But because it was Police Scotland's, I got the medical professional to ensure that what was the content of the ABD package and what was in the manual was correct.
A couple of things I'd like to ask you about that. You said you incorporated it into a mandatory training package on ABD for Police Scotland.
Yes.
And tell us about this mandatory training package, what it was.
So I'd identified that there was, in my view, a kind of significant knowledge gap there, and that we had to, to provide some training to our officers in relation to this condition or set of symptoms and the management of it. So we have an e-learning platform, an e-learning platform, Police Scotland. So I then created an e-learning training course programme on ABD that all police officers had to undertake.
And when was that?
I think it was 2015, but I can't be sure.
Right. We can check.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So that was something that you were working on, but you can't remember exactly when that was made available to all the
I can't remember
officers.
exactly when the training was introduced, sorry.
And just looking back briefly at paragraph 14, you say this is in relation to the instructor's manual. I instructed that the instructor's manual no longer be referred to and that we only referred to and taught the techniques that were contained within the 2013 manual. Do you remember when you gave that instruction?
I remember sending an email. No, I'm sorry, I don't. It could have been 2000. I think it was 2014, but I couldn't remember the exact date. Sorry.
Do you remember in relation to the review that you were carrying out, was it before you'd completed it, after you started it? Does that help in any way? No.
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
Right. And the email you sent, who did that go to?
So that went to all officer safety instructors nationally.
How many were there at that time?
At that time, I think there was around about 110 to 120.
So you told all of the instructors, stop using this manual, use the student manual from 2013.
That's correct.
Right. So did that instruction assist with the standardisation that you were trying to achieve?
It was the first step, yes.
First step. So if one of the officers who was at Hayfield Road was a training instructor, then he, by May 2015, he would have received that instruction from you, that email from you saying don't use the instructor's manual anymore.
Yes, if he was an instructor then, yes, he would have been on the mailing list, yes.
Okay. And he would have been using the 2013 manual at that time, in May 2015.
Should have been.
Right. Can I look at paragraph 16, please? Let me just check this. When I took over and did the national review, I couldn't find any provenance for the instructor manual. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know where the information came from. That's what you've been telling us about. At the bottom of the page, as we look at it, it says, There was no standardisation, that was the issue, so it's difficult to know how much it was used. This instructor's manual was used for instructors' courses until I discontinued its use in 2016, and then if we can move down please, when it was superseded by the new OST manual and associated trainer guides. Can I just be clear? You give the instruction to all the instructors not to use the manual, but the new 2016 manual didn't come in until 2016. During that period, are you confident that all the instructors stopped using their instructor manual and threw it away or got rid of it or shredded it?
No.
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 All right. Can we look at paragraph 17? I said we would come back to talk about the challenges that you faced when you hadn't come into the job originally. In paragraph 17 you say one of the challenges we faced was we had instructors of all ages and experience. We had instructors who'd been trained back in the 90s. I have absolutely no idea what training material they ever got or what training course they received. When I started, they were just instructors. We had instructors who'd attended an instructor's course at Tullyallen. That way we knew roughly what they'd been taught. So there may have been reference material they used from legacy forces that I couldn't track down during the review. When I questioned, why are you teaching that particular technique? It's not in the manual, I've never seen it before. A regular response was, well, so-and-so taught me this back in the day and I still use it and I still like it. So it really was very, very disparate, so it's difficult to point to one source of reference for instructors. And during the review I didn't speak to all 200 OST instructors to see what materials they used. However, it wouldn't surprise me if back then some instructors were still using legacy material. Can we go back up the page slightly, Miss Wildgoose? So, can you explain to the chair a little bit more about your experiences during this time with the instructors? You said they were all different ages and experience. Tell us what challenges you faced when you came into your job.
So, I suppose to go back, sir, OST has been in existence round about 94, 95 for Strathclyde, and then other forces back then would take on, you would introduce, probably what we kind of look at just now, the kind of current officer safety training. And that has obviously morphed and developed and enhanced over the years. But each force, prior to the introduction of Police Scotland, each force was responsible for its own officer safety training and what techniques they decided to include in their own programme. To be an instructor back then, was, again, there was different avenues or different ways that you could become an instructor. Some of the manufacturers of the equipment, who manufactured the batons and supplied them and the handcuffs, etc., would deliver instructors' courses. Some of the instructors would go abroad and be trained as an instructor or an advanced instructor. Some went down south. So really, to become an instructor, there was a number of different ways that one could become one.
And the chair may be aware that when they brought in PR24 batons, officers would often go abroad or down south to get training.
That's correct.
And teach that particular piece of equipment.
Yes.
Same with rigid handcuffs when they were brought in.
Yes.
So specific changes to equipment used by officers could give rise to officers trained in that particular piece of equipment.
That's correct, and what you'd find is the manufacturers of that piece of equipment would also deliver training in control and restraint, or other aspects of officer safety training. Some of the instructors would go to the Scottish Prison Service, for instance, and see what they were, and incorporate that into their own training programme. Go to the military, they would use maybe their own martial arts backgrounds to inform their own legacy training programme.
So would these instructors absorb information from a number of different sources?
Yes.
Potentially?
Yes.
And then that would inform their own type of training that they delivered to other student
But-
officers or recertification?
Yes, back then, yes.
Yeah.
And also you have, I suppose, the recognised police restraint techniques that have been, police restraint techniques since time immemorial, I suppose. They're still effective and they still work, so they were included as well. So we had instructors at that time. When I did the review, it was difficult to pinpoint, who had instructed them, what qualifications that instructor had to instruct. It was difficult.
And just in terms of records, if we were looking into records for individuals, prior to you coming in and standardising the training, so for officers who may be older, more experienced, were you able to identify which instructors had trained which officers?
Only at the Scottish Police College, and then only within certain areas. Again, each area's record keeping was disparate. So if a probationary constable went to Tullyallen and received their OST training, we could probably, yes, identify what instructors were involved in that training. If we went to certain legacy forces, then yes, we could identify what instructor delivered what training during the refresher. Others, no.
And as well as identifying the instructor, what was the position in relation to identifying the content of the training?
There wasn't one.
Can I ask you about something that you mentioned in a PERC statement while we're talking about this? PERC 00390, and it's page 4. And I wanted to ask you, you'll see at the bottom of the page, I've been asked by the investigators if there is a record kept for documenting which instructor trained an individual officer. I can confirm that currently this information is recorded and is retained centrally within officer safety training. Currently this information clearly details the officer in attendance, location of the training, details of the OST trainer providing each aspect of the training, and a breakdown of the individual components. This was introduced from January 2016. So was this one of your recommendations or one of your changes that you implemented?
Yes, we, to keep accurate training records for audit purposes, for any other purpose, you need to know, when the officer attended their training, who trained them, and what the content of the training they received. Yes.
Yeah. And so that good record keeping came in January 2016, but prior to that, you've used the word disparate to talk about whether you could identify the instructor, whether you could identify the content, whether you can really tell us what that audit trail is not certain.
No, it wasn't, no.
Right. And are you aware if there is anywhere a repository somewhere where there are all these records that we could identify training for individuals or the content of that training?
Again, each area is different, and during the review I had significant challenges in trying to track down training records from certain areas, so I couldn't answer that, sorry.
So if there was that information, it'd be held locally. And can you tell us, say an officer moved from one area to another, moved from Fife to another area, or went from Lothian and Borders to Fife, would their training records follow them, or would they remain within that local area?
I couldn't actually say when each legacy force moved on to the centralised scope system, the system to coordinate personnel and establishment, where now and for a number of years training records are updated onto that system so they can be accessed throughout the full force, and that personal training record is personal to that officer. Prior and I know that different legacy forces went on to scope at different times. They didn't all, you know. So I don't know how the paper records were uploaded onto scope.
Okay.
And I don't know how, if an officer moved prior to scope, how those training records would go with them, sorry.
That's not part of your remit.
No.
But we have seen some scope records for individuals, but they were the new system that was brought in, were
Yes.
they? Right, thank you. I'd like to move on and look at a PowerPoint presentation, please. And we'll look at the first one, which is mentioned in paragraph 20 of your... Let's look at paragraph 20 of your inquiry statement first, just to move on to this section. And you'll see there it says probationer OST training PowerPoint, and you were shown two different versions of PowerPoint presentations used in the initial OST training provided to probationers. And you can confirm that the content of the first is entitled Police Scotland Safety Training PowerPoint, and then brackets historic, that's COPFS 05973. This is a version that would have been used in initial OST training 2013 to 2015. So the one marked historic is the one that would have been in place between 2013 and 2015. And then there's a second one entitled Police Scotland Safety Training PowerPoint, and that's labelled current, and that's the PowerPoint that you introduced to support the new programme and the new manual in 2016.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's look at the historic one that was used in 2013 to 2015. It's COPFS 05973. And we'll see the page 1. This is the first slide, Police Scotland Officer Safety Training. And I know it's 36 pages long, I think. And can we just have a look at this? Do you know, was this used before 2013?
Yes, or a version of it, yes, a similar version of it, yes.
So this or a similar version. This one at the bottom is dated 24th July 2013. But this is the one that would have been used prior to May 2015. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, yes.
And we'll just go through this briefly if we can. We've looked at this with some other witnesses. If we go through, we'll just scroll down, and we'll see that the page 2 relates to use of force. Sorry. So, can we go through each page? Thank you. So there's a use of force. Force must only be used when it is reasonable, an absolute necessity, the minimum amount necessary, and proportionate to the seriousness of the case. And officers must be accountable for their decisions and actions, and must be able to show a legal basis for their actions. Is this about force being justified? This is how they would justify the use of force.
Yeah, this, as I referred to earlier on, this is the number of elements that...
And so these are the individual elements that make up that.
Yes, sir.
For an officer,
Yes.
they would have to consider it reasonable, a necessity, absolute necessity, the minimum amount necessary, and proportionate. And by covering these 4 bullet points, that makes them accountable for the decisions and actions and will give them a legal basis for using force. This explanation, was that an explanation that was given prior to 2013? Is this an explanation that most officers would understand?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And if we could just go through the next page. So then we talk about criteria for use of force. Justification, the level of force must be reasonable for the resistance exhibited by the subject. So this relates to justifying the use of force, but having regard to what the subject is doing.
Yes.
And that's the behaviour. You mentioned earlier profile offender behaviour. We'll
Yes.
come on to that shortly. And then preclusion. Can you tell me what preclusion is?
So preclusion allows you to choose the least intrusive force option by looking at other options and saying, well, why did I choose a particular option? Because you have to have said to yourself, why wouldn't that lower force option have worked? Could I have used it? Or I have considered using a lower force option and it wouldn't work.
And you can do that based on your own experience or your training? Or
Training, so you preclude
Right.
other options and it leaves you with the most appropriate option, yes.
And again, is that a concept that most police officers would understand?
Yes.
Thank you. And then on to the next slide, please. Tactical communications. I'm interested in what officers were being taught about tactical communications.
Again, there is, I suppose, a significant amount of information that contained within the manual that wasn't necessarily all taught. I would suggest that there wasn't an awful lot taught about tactical communications, or not as much as there should have been.
Has that changed now?
I think yes, definitely.
So what was taught at this time? We've got this slide. Can you tell us what techniques or what was taught to officers?
So this slide here obviously forms part of the, I suppose, the lecture style OST theory, 3.5 hours that officers receive at the very beginning of the programme. They would then go into the practical element. So this, as far as I remember, was really the only information they received on tactical communications. And during the practical elements, there was parts of tactical communications that were reinforced.
What parts?
So because of the absence of scenario-based training at the time, really the only tactical communications in my opinion, that officers received was, to give commands, loud verbal commands, to allow, officers to take control, gain compliance of subjects, the loud shout of "get back." That was really all that they received at that time, in my view.
And we've heard a phrase used, de-escalation. Tell us about that. Is that a new phrase that's used, or was it something that was discussed alongside tactical communications?
Unfortunately, in my view, de-escalation didn't play a part in the tactical communications. If you look at how de-escalation back then was viewed, it was about reducing your use of force when you gained subject compliance. It wasn't about, as we would think about de-escalation now, how to diffuse a situation, how to try and minimise use of force, using body language, using voice, using tactics and positioning, to try and minimise use of force. That really wasn't a concept that was discussed back then.
So the training that's provided now has evolved and changed under your direction.
Yes.
And how would you describe the quantity of material that's given to officers now on tactical communications or de-escalation compared to in 2015?
So I suppose the focus, in my view, the focus of the programme back then was about physical skills. It was about gaining control and compliance, not about managing that conflict situation, not about conflict management. So with the new programme in 2016, we brought in a separate, I suppose, element into the programme about conflict management, where we talked about de-escalation skills, softer policing skills. We talked about how tactics and self-awareness, are able to, have an impact on that conflict situation, a positive impact. We introduced more about dealing with people in crisis intervention. So the amount of softer policing skills and conflict management skills that are in the programme just now is I think it's a significant difference to what was in the programme back then.
I'm going to carry on.
Would it be convenient for you to take a break? We'll have a break for 20 minutes. Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at the historic PowerPoint, the one that applied during 2013 to 2015, so just immediately prior to 2015. Could we go back to that, please? I'm not going to refer you to every page, but there are a number of pages I'm interested in you talking about. Now we were, can we go back to number 9? Is that it? Tactical communications. We were talking about that. And so there was some training given to officers about taking information in through their eyes. Don't underestimate the visual impact of your appearance and body language. We've heard some evidence that, you know, when police officers arrive with their police vehicles, maybe with the blue lights and the sirens on, they're in full uniform, they've got equipment, and there's 2 of them. They can be quite an imposing presence, and sometimes even just the mere existence or presence of those officers can have an impact on a subject. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right. And when it said 80% of information is taken in through the eyes, what was that designed to remind officers about or probationers about?
So, in a conflict situation, or in any, I suppose, two-way communication process, the body takes in 80% of information through sight. The brain does. 20% is taken in through listening. So basically, a human being will take in more information visually than they do auditory. And therefore, a lot of the basis of OST back then through this was about how that officer would present themselves. So because a lot of the information is taken in through the eyes, that's why you'll see police officers putting their hands up, you know, to tell people to get back, to back off. A lot of visual movements, because the body will more readily take in those than commands.
And equally, presumably those percentages apply to officers. They will take most of their information through observing the subject or watching to see what they can glean from what they see.
That's correct, but I suppose what's also of relevance is that this is, and I suppose, in a normal type of interaction. When you have a conflict situation where adrenaline is coursing through the body, where what we call a chemical cocktail, a number of, you know, fight or flight, freeze emotions taking place, then that changes. That can change, and therefore each officer or each person involved in that instant, what the information they take in can be different for each person.
And there'll be a number of factors that are the reasons for that.
Yes.
And so, coming back to what you said earlier when we were looking at the manual, 2 different police officers can interpret situations differently.
Very much so.
And factors, we've heard some evidence that factors can be their own experience,
Yes.
the equipment they have,
Yes.
the training they've had, whether they're with other officers, the location could be a factor. All
Yes.
of these things we've heard evidence about already.
Skill levels, yes.
Skill levels. Yeah, thank you. And that can explain why each individual might come to slightly different impressions or views of any given situation.
And thereafter may act differently, yes.
Their position, how long they've been there, that all of those are factors.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Can we look at the next slide, please? I think this is 10. It talks about the 5-step positive style of tactical communications. Now, we've heard some evidence from other officers about this. And would you just explain to the chair, this is obviously one of the slides in the PowerPoint, what sort of information was being given to officers at this time, summarised here on this slide?
So the 5-step positive style is a communications model that is taught to police officers, or was taught to police officers, enabling them to go through, I suppose, a linear process of gaining compliance or control of an individual.
So the aim was to gain compliance or control.
Yes.
And can you explain or give examples of any of these different 5-step styles? Ethical appeal.
So that, I suppose you would start off, I suppose, at a kind of low level, and you'd make an appeal to that person's own moral compass, I suppose, if you want to call it that. And so if someone was potentially behaving in a certain manner or maybe possibly committing offences, you would explain to them, you would try to explain to them their own, I suppose, morals or ethics, what they've been doing potentially could be wrong.
And then a reasonable appeal and explain.
So that's when you basically ask that person to cease and desist their behaviour, and you explain why. So because maybe somebody may be committing an offence, or they may be causing others, maybe causing a disturbance, etc. Then, yeah.
How would an officer demonstrate that he was being or she was being reasonable? What is it about them that...
So what you're doing is you're actually reasoning with that person. So you are making a reasonable, I suppose, request of that person. Could you please stop shouting and swearing because? And you explain the reason why.
So this is not a command or a shout or anything like that?
It shouldn't be.
And then personal appeal and options?
So that's when you make an appeal to that person, and you, I suppose, you outline the potential consequences of that person's actions.
To them personally?
To them personally. So if you don't stop this behaviour, you could be arrested. The consequences of that arrest could be financial, you could lose a job, it could impact your family, etc.
And practical appeal and confirmation?
That's basically the last step, when you say to that person, is there anything that I could reasonably do, to make you stop your behaviour?
And then action?
Is whatever action you decide to take, whether that be detention, arrest, etc.
So it could be detention, arrest, or use of force, or
Yes,
some
yes.
physical action
Yes.
at that stage. Is there a limit? Are officers taught that there's a limit on the number of appeals that can be made?
No.
Is there a limit on the types of appeal that can be made? Is there only one? Do you pick one of 4, or could you try all 4?
You could try all, it depends on each individual circumstance.
Is there a limit on the time that officers are advised they should take over any
No.
of this? And are there any circumstances where officers are advised this is not this style of communications is not suitable?
It was all that officers had at the time was this tactical communications model. So that's what was taught.
And you're obviously a police officer. Is this the type of style of communication that you have used personally in your own experience?
I suppose before I undertook certain roles, then yes. I suppose it follows a kind of reasonable format, a kind of natural format, and it is what most if you listen, most police officers will go through this process of a sort. They don't. Very rarely have I seen officers stick rigidly to this. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's more in protest type situations, but and I suppose in a conflict management situation, as you normally get as a police officer. I've seen it used, I've seen it not used.
How effective did you find it when you've used it in your experience?
I don't personally like it.
Tell me why.
This is about control and compliance in my view. There is nothing about listening, there is nothing about empathising, there's nothing about trying to understand what that person's going through if you can. It's very much police focused, and I think it's outdated.
You see that there's no empathy, there's no understanding. What type of style of communication do you think works well?
For me, when you, I suppose, if you want to take in the concept of de-escalation, the concept of conflict management, softer skills, for me is about listening. It's about trying to understand. You can get an awful lot of information from someone when you just listen to them. It's about good tactics. So by standing off, by giving that person time and space, they're less likely to feel intimidated by you. Therefore, you're more likely to get a positive outcome. With the understanding that there may always be at times a requirement to use physical force. It's the nature of the job that we do. That is the type of, I suppose, the type of approach that's always worked well for me, and I've seen it work well in a lot of officers, and it's the type of approach that we use during our taser training just now.
Is that the type of approach that is being taught to officers now?
Yes, I would suggest so, yes.
You mentioned the words giving time and space. Can you explain what you meant by that?
So, I suppose back at the time of the incident, there wasn't really any tactical training as such. It was very much focused on physical skills, gaining control and compliance. So giving time and space is a tactic. Now we did talk about, I suppose, creating a reaction gap, maintaining a reaction gap back then, and what we call contact and cover, where we have officers standing off a subject, out with, I suppose, the assault zones. But when it can be done, it's an effective tactic, especially when someone's in crisis, especially if someone's aggressive or upset or whatever. It's a very effective tactic just to stand off and give someone time and space. If the instant, if it allows, if the circumstances allow, because you have to remember that sometimes the police will have to take, immediate positive action. But standing off and giving time and space, it's less intimidating, and it allows the subject potentially to vent, and then it's a tactic that has been recognised that can help minimise use of force.
You talk about circumstances. Tell us about the sort of circumstances that might exist where you cannot use that type of tactic. What would the circumstances have to be where police officers immediately have to act?
If there is an immediate risk of threat or harm to the individual themselves, to others, or to the police.
Right. An immediate risk of threat or harm, so physical or
Yes.
their well-being or
Yes.
something. Yeah. So if you remove that immediate risk, does that then provide that space for time and space as you're describing?
I mean, again, it's difficult to say because it very much depends on the location, the circumstances, each individual, impact factors. These are things that make each incident unique, I suppose. The police have a positive power to act, so we will always at times have to arrest people, even if they're not, even if there's not an immediate threat of risk or harm. We have to bring people before the courts, etc. So, I would suggest that nowadays the ethos has changed to around about trying to slow things down, and to try and communicate better with subjects, give them that time and space where we can, but again with the caveat that it's not always possible.
But now you see in your role as a trainer that Police Scotland see the benefit of more time and space to communicate with the person.
Very much so. The conflict management is now becoming far more, the focus of the training, or it was before I left anyway. That was the direction we wanted to go.
Before 2020?
Yes, we wanted to redress that balance between physical skills and softer skills, whereas we thought before the balance was greater in the physical skills aspect, which are very important, of course, but we thought we could redress that balance a bit and move in that direction. And I think we are, compared to what we were with the previous programme, yes.
But ultimately, the circumstances as exist at any moment are the key to understanding what options are open to a police officer.
Yes, that's every circumstance could be different, and it's based on the threat, risk and harm, and it's based on that risk assessment by the officer, the officer's perception, etc. Yes.
Mm. And all the different factors that you've mentioned, and we've heard evidence about the geographical location, the training the officers have, the size of the officers, what their perspective is, what their mindset is.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next slide, please, which I think, is it 11? Tactical communications for gaining compliance. Now, here's this word compliance. You've mentioned that a few times. And down the left-hand side, it says communicate, explain, ask, inform, de-escalate. Can you speak through what was being taught in relation to this slide?
Yes, so I suppose the definition we used to give of tactical communications was that communication process for obtaining control or compliance. And that ultimately back then was the goal. So this was, I suppose, a model, a communications model to gain that compliance through verbalising as opposed to using physical force. And it was very much about you explained the situation to the subject and you required them to comply. And if they didn't comply, there were consequences, which usually ended up in arrest. And then once you're arrested, then that's when we used that term de-escalate. As I said, I think it was used wrongly back then. It was used to, you would reduce the amount of force once you gained compliance, as opposed to using it as a tool to diffuse a situation initially.
Right. So the examples we see on this slide relate to effectively speaking to
Yes.
the subject.
Yes.
And the first, communicate, speak calmly and clearly. And is this to enhance the students' knowledge about tone, volume of voice, the manner in which they're speaking?
Yes, we would include that all is included in the speak calmly and clearly part of it, yes.
And then explain to the subject what the officer is doing, why they're there, presumably what their
Yes.
intention is. Ask the subject why are they not complying. So this is giving the subject an opportunity to respond to a question.
Yes.
And then inform that you may need to use force. So it's not using force, it's effectively giving a warning to the subject
Yes.
that you may have to resort to force.
Physical force. Yes.
So again, the steps here are about not using force, but about discussing that with the subject.
Yes.
And then de-escalate, and you think this was the wrong definition, but when you gain control or compliance.
Yes.
And again, were officers at this time taught that you can only do one or two, or were they taught you could do all of them?
Again, it's down to that each individual incident is different. So you will get some people, some individuals who will, comply after 30 seconds, others who you'll have to go through this process a number of times or expand each element of the process to get to where you want to get to.
So officers weren't taught that there was a time limit,
No.
or that try one, it doesn't work,
No.
ignore the rest.
No,
They
and
weren't
there's
taught.
times when officers were taught that sometimes this wouldn't even be applicable. There would be times when
Yeah.
that attempt to go through this communication model just wouldn't be relevant.
Where there's an immediate risk to the public or a police
I would
officer's health and well-being.
I would suggest so, yes.
Yeah. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So this is, we won't labour on this. I'd like to actually move on to slide 20, if you're able to identify that. Yeah, that's actually, I'll if we can go back to the previous slide. That is a demonstration of the conflict resolution model that you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. And then can we go next, on to the next slide? We see profiled offender behaviour. You mentioned that earlier as well. We'll come back to this, but we see that there are 6 levels of profiled offender behaviour. So this is the subject that might be looking at. It's the offender.
Yes.
The alleged offender. Can you talk us through these 6 levels, please?
So officers were taught to try and categorise a subject's behaviour, again through the conflict, through the confrontational continuum, so that they would be able to choose the most appropriate tactical option based on the subject behaviour. So obviously compliance, as it says, it's when that person was cooperating, wholeheartedly with the police. Verbal abuse or gestures, as again, as it explains, it's that person maybe shouting, swearing, being verbally abusive, gesturing with their hands, etc. Passive resistance. So passive resistance, as an example, would be if a protester's in the middle of a road and simply refusing to move, would use that dead weight. That's what we call passive resistance. Active resistance is when the subject, I suppose, is resisting the officer but not trying to assault the officer. So that would be an example of trying to pull away, trying to get away, but not actually trying to assault the officer.
So if an officer had their arm or their
Yes.
wrist and they were resisting,
They were trying
going
to pull
with,
away, maybe trying to get away.
so that would be active
That's active
resistance.
resistance, yes. Assaultive resistance, as I said, is when, the subject is actively trying to assault the police officer. And then serious aggravated resistance is that higher level of assault resistance, and that could include the use of a weapon. Mainly that's what we talk about, serious aggravated resistance.
So level 6 is generally the use of a weapon.
Generally use of a weapon, or assaultive resistance to the nature where the injury sustained could be very, very serious.
Right. And we've heard some evidence about profiled offender behaviour, and I'm sure we'll hear more during this hearing. But tell me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that these aren't neat categories that everything will fall into one or other.
Yes.
That there's a blending between them. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes, it's a model that can be very helpful, but with others they find it slightly either constrictive or open to interpretation.
So is it possible for one officer to say it's level 4, one officer to say I think it's level 5?
Yes.
Or between two?
Yes.
Or one to say it sort of falls in the middle? They're not very sure?
Yes, it's again down to each individual officer's perception.
Right. And in any given circumstances, it'll be up to an officer to make an assessment
Yes.
themselves. And then can we look at the next slide? And then we see this is officer response options, and it's levels 1 to 5. So it doesn't tally exactly
No.
with the 1 to 6 we saw in relation to the subject, the profiled offender behaviour. Could you talk us through this slide, please?
So, officer presence, as you explained earlier on, it's about the presence of a police officer, whether it be in uniform or plain clothes, and the hopefully positive effect that can have on diffusing a situation. And that, the officer's uniform, as you say, the equipment, the hat, whatever it may be. The next level is obviously tactical communications, and that's where the officer will use their communication skills to either make direction or commands, or to try and diffuse the situation.
We looked at the slide
Yes,
before about the 5
yes.
positive steps.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
Thank
And they
you.
use their own communication skills. Yes. Control skills is what I suppose what you would more commonly refer to as control and restraint. So that's likes of holds, various types of holds. That's normally the handcuffing, anything to control the physical actions of a subject. Defensive tactics normally will include strikes. So that would be use of batting, striking with either the knee, the foot, the elbow. That's what we normally, and then takedowns. So when you take someone down to the ground to control and restrain them, and then deadly force is obviously either the use of police issue firearms, or a strike to an area of the body which could result in serious injury or death.
Such as?
Such as a bat and strike to the head, the use of anything to defend yourself if it's proportionate, reasonable and necessary.
Where would the use of sprays come within these levels?
So the use of spray is a slightly complicated. It really depends. In most cases it straddles both control skills and defensive tactics. When spray was first introduced, and for many years, the use of PAVA or CS sprays it was at the time was what was called a defensive tactic, and really that put it into the category of only being used to defend the police officer or someone else. Over the years it's kind of moved into a control skill. So I can't actually remember that time where it sat in the manual. I think it was still a defensive tactic. But as I say, I know down south and in the rest of the UK it's a control skill. It sits there.
So you think it may have been in 2015 a level 4?
I think it was a level 4. I may be wrong. It may have moved to level 3 by that time.
We'll hear more about
Yeah,
this.
thank you.
Can we look at the next slide, please? This is you talked about a graph earlier. Now, this is the conflict resolution model that you mentioned earlier, isn't it?
Also known as the confrontational continuum, yes.
Right. And you'll see on the left it says profiled offender behaviour, and on the bottom, use of force response options. I'm wondering if you can help us in relation to the sort of training that's given, because we know from profiled offender behaviour there were 6 levels, officer response there are 5, so there's not a neat line you can draw from one to the other.
No.
And I wonder if you could help the chair understand how it is that an officer will determine what response to use depending on the profiled offender behaviour.
Basically, as you see it here, the officers were taught to identify the behaviour of the subject, which would then, sorry, my apologies.
No, don't worry.
And then from the behaviour of the subject, they would be able to correlate a response option based on this graph.
Were they were trained on this, we see it in the PowerPoint. Were they supposed to remember this?
Yes.
Right. So could you give us some examples? Let's use the easy ones first. Serious or aggravated resistance from the offender. That's the worst level.
Yes.
And show us how we work out the response there from a reasonable response from an officer.
So using this particular model, you would just follow the red dotted lines, and you would go from serious and then go to the axis, the middle, and then drop down, and that allowed you to use deadly force in that circumstance.
Do you have to use deadly force?
No.
You'd mentioned earlier that there's a minimum principle of minimum force necessary.
Yes.
Would it be possible that someone's using, say, aggressive resistance and you don't need to use deadly force or defensive tactics?
You absolutely don't know. And for me, it's one of the the criticisms I had, and many people have of this model, which is why it's been discontinued, is that it can either be too prescriptive or not prescriptive enough.
Yeah. And equally, you could have someone who is compliant. Your presence as an officer may assist, but you may need something more than that. You may need to go to tactical communications.
Yes, and if you look at the graph, tactical communications doesn't correlate with compliance,
Yeah.
and that's where the confusion and come in.
So in the real world, was there much more fluidity between these different levels than would appear to be the case from this graph?
Absolutely, and there was elements of use of force training that just simply aren't incorporated into this graph.
But equally, if you are faced with a compliant person, you would not consider in any circumstances that deadly force would be appropriate at that stage.
No, it gives you a rough, I suppose, guide.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Let's move on. I had it as slides 26 to 28. Let's stick with positional asphyxia. You have, I think for this slide and the next two slides, we have slides about positional asphyxia. And this was also taught to officers in relation to the PowerPoint slides.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about positional asphyxia?
So positional asphyxia or restraint-related asphyxia is when an individual is in a certain position that interferes with their body's normal process of breathing. It can be caused by pressure on the lungs themselves, on the rib cage, on the diaphragm, on the back. It's usually can be caused by some sort of compression to the mechanism of breathing.
And it says their death can occur rapidly.
That's
Is that
correct.
something that's known to police officers?
Yes, very much so. Yes.
And as well as compression being applied, can it also be just from the position the person's sitting in?
Yes, so depending on the impact factors, but yes, we try and avoid what we call a W position, whereby if that person's knees are up, that can restrict breathing. So yeah, it can be caused by, even if a person is standing and maybe pressure's put on the person. So it's not just about prone, it can be a number of different positions, yes.
But it says restraints can increase that risk.
Very much so, yes.
And that's would you say that's commonly known to police officers?
This is one of the areas of use of force training that was constantly reinforced when I was in training, yes.
It sounds like use of force and the repercussions or the consequences of that are heavily trained to officers.
Yes, it's like going back to the earlier point, is that we give officers a range of options and we provide the implications of those options. And as long as the officers know the implications, it's then up to them to decide in all the circumstances what use of force option is reasonable, proportionate, necessary. Yes.
And they have to justify if they use force, and you've told us about that earlier.
Yes.
Can we move on to the next slide, please? And then you talked about risk factors contributable to the condition. Can you tell us what these are?
So there's a number of factors that could make positional asphyxia, the negative outcome of positional asphyxia more likely.
The negative outcome being possible death?
Yes, that's correct. So body position, restraint, is prone, inability to escape position, really are all very, very similar. In that pressure, they all put pressure on the body's ability for normal inhalation and expiration. And these are, I say, these are always heavily reinforced during OST training, and then the rest are just other impacts factors that can contribute to the onset of positional asphyxia.
And then moving on to the next slide. It says signs and symptoms, active to passive, loud to quiet. Tell me what that is.
So one of the main signs of someone who is suffering from positional asphyxia is that they will very often be maybe shouting or verbalising, and they all of a sudden they'll stop that and they'll go to very quiet, or they will be actively resisting, struggling, and then all of a sudden they stop struggling. That's one of the main indicators that you know that something's untoward. When someone's obviously having an inability for normal inhalation and expiration, sometimes you can get a build up of fluid, which will cause maybe a gurgling, a rasping, that type of sound. Someone verbalising that they can't breathe, and then you will see a discoloration at times of skin colour because the oxygen's not getting to the extremities.
And is the discoloration the cyanosis that we see there?
That's correct, yes.
And if nothing else, all of these things could be signs of positional asphyxia.
All or even on individual on their own.
And positional asphyxia at that time, pre-2015, was being taught to officers.
Very much so, yes.
Emphasised even.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next slide, please. We see here excited delirium, and we've heard that this is a controversial title.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit of information about what officers were being taught in relation to this PowerPoint, the 2013-2015 PowerPoint?
In my experience, I think there's 2 slides, maybe 3 slides.
I think the next slide is also excited delirium.
Yeah, and from my recollection, it was mentioned, it was quickly covered in the lecture style, input. And in my experience, that was really, it wasn't ever revisited as far as I'm concerned. It may be revisited by certain instructors, but in the main, I don't ever recall it being revisited apart from their initial training.
We've heard evidence from officers that they've recognised the term.
Yes.
Tell us what was taught in relation to this slide.
So this slide would be spoken through, and the instructors would explain what excited delirium is, and in this slide here is, I suppose, the main signs and symptoms, indicators, if you want, of what how someone would display these signs and symptoms. Yep.
Let's look at them. The first one is a person exhibits violent behaviour in a bizarre and manic way.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I mean, obviously, every person who is experiencing this type of condition may be very different, but some of the, I suppose, the common signs and symptoms is that their behaviour is extremely bizarre and erratic. Very often they're manic, so they're constantly moving, they're constantly doing stuff, they can't sit still, stand still. You will find that their speech is incoherent. A lot of times they'll have a sense of panic about them. They may be violent, or their behaviour may be construed as violence or aggressiveness. And it's just a very, very bizarre behaviour to witness.
And then constant, purposeless, often violent activity.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So if you see someone who is going through this, then you'll see that they constantly move. There is no purpose, there's no reason to their behaviour. and at times they will lash out to be violent, whether it be you will see them smashing windows, especially windows, because glasses they are often attracted to or have a fear of reflection in glass, so a lot of times they will smash windows, but their behaviour is just, as I say, there's no rhyme or reason to it, there's no meaning to it, and it's a very, very difficult situation to manage.
Meaningless speech and hallucinations with paranoid delusions. How was that explained to the officers?
So again, that's about the incoherence of the speech. You'll tend to find they don't make any sense. Their speech are very, very bizarre, and they may be either visually or auditory hallucinating. So they may be hearing, they may be hearing things that aren't occurring. They may be seeing things that aren't there. And I say this paranoid delusion links in with this sense of panic that they often experience. They feel that someone's there to hurt them, or they're going to be hurt, or they're going to be injured, or they're going to die. It's that overwhelming fear of panic which can cause the paranoia.
Abnormally strong or abnormal strength, perhaps, and pain tolerance. What are those?
Yes. So restraining any individual is very difficult in the best of times. But you tend to find, and I've experienced it myself, you tend to find that trying to restrain someone who is in that state of, that bizarre or manic state, they don't feel pain, or they're very intolerant to pain, very tolerant to pain, and they have this inner abnormal strength that, as I say, it's difficult to describe, but they can become very, very strong.
So again, if nothing else, demonstrations of abnormal strength or pain tolerance could be indicators of excited delirium.
Could be indicators of other things, but yes, could be.
And then CS may not work. What's that?
I was never ever. This is the same. It's not just CS, but it could be batons don't work, physical restraint doesn't work, and then I suppose this specific reference to CS is that 60 to 70% of the population will experience some sort of effect from an irritant spray. People who are maybe in this manic state are able to fight through the effects of incapacitant spray.
So they can be resistant to
Yes.
the effects.
Yes.
So again, that could be another warning sign or indicator of excited
It could be,
delirium.
yes.
Thank you. The next one, maybe the second one on excited delirium. And then it's given as the causes: drugs, alcohol intoxication, psychiatric illness, or a combination. So officers are taught that this could be the underlying cause.
Yes.
And that includes a psychiatric illness as well as intoxication.
Yes.
And the medical emergency column here: expect a sudden collapse. Acute exhaustive mania can be fatal. Tell me what officers were taught about this being a medical emergency.
So the risk of death is significant if someone's in this manic state, and officers were taught that it should be treated as a medical emergency.
And so for an officer who's treating something as a medical emergency, what do they do?
They obviously have to get medical attention as soon as possible. So in this case, they were taught that they should always contact an ambulance as soon as possible.
Sorry, how does an officer contact an ambulance as soon as possible? How do
Through
they do
their own
that?
personal radios.
So they make an airways transmission over the radio.
Yes,
And as I understand it, we've heard evidence that goes to the area control room,
that's correct.
and they will be able to facilitate calling an ambulance.
Yes.
So that's the way that an officer on a street can obtain medical assistance as soon as possible.
Yes.
And is there a limit to the number of warning signs that the officer sees before they treat something as a medical emergency? Were they told or taught that you need at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of these signs to be obvious before you phone for an ambulance, or
In
were there any
respect of-
limitations?
Of ED?
Yeah, if we go back to the previous slide, actually, if that's possible.
Okay.
You've got 5 different things there. Were they taught that there had to be a minimum number before they called for an ambulance?
If I was delivering the input, then no. It was based on these are the signs and symptoms. If you believe that this person is experiencing excited delirium, there's also other signs and symptoms, but if you then call an ambulance ASAP.
Do you remember what those other signs were?
So as I said, one was a fascination with broken glass. One of the main indicators is due to the hyperthermia, the increased body temperature, is a lot of times you'll see them removing their clothing.
So they might not be wearing as much as you might expect.
Very often, yes.
And we don't see anything about clothing on that slide.
No.
But was that the sort of information that was being taught at the time?
As I say, if I was delivering the input, then I would mention, the clothing, the other signs and symptoms. But no, that was included later on in the ABD package when we introduced that. But these were the main signs and symptoms that were known back then. But that was specifically towards ED.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but could we briefly have a look at your inquiry statement again, please? Sorry, paragraph 21, please. I don't want to forget to ask you about this, Inspector Young. 21, requirement for standardisation of OST training. In the run-up to the creation of Police Scotland, there was work ongoing for a couple of years prior to this on reform work streams or standardisation work streams, so likes of firearms custody arrangements, so that come 1st of April 2013, all the firearms officers in Scotland worked in a similar way. However, OST didn't have a standardisation work stream. Can you give a little bit more of an explanation about this?
Again, I'm not that well versed on the exact processes regarding the creation of Police Scotland. Being ex-firearms, I knew colleagues in the firearms department, and I knew that they were working on, I suppose, the reform work stream where to bring all the legacy arrangements together so that something is obviously as important and high risk as police use of firearms had a standardised approach come the creation of the national service. I think it was maybe similar with custody. I don't know, again, that's just my understanding. I understand there's probably a number of other reform work streams in other areas of business within the organisation for the same reason. But as I say, OST, we didn't have any work ongoing prior to the creation of the force to ensure that when the force was created, we had a standardised approach across the country.
When you came into your position, your national position, and you've told us earlier about doing your review and going round the instructors and gathering in information, and then ultimately you created and devised the 2016 manual. Were you brought into that job in order to provide this standardisation, or was that a byproduct of your own? I just identified what I saw was the challenges and the issues, and I approached the senior management to say that we really require to address this, and this is what I think we need to do to address it, and so it went from there. So because you took over the role, you reviewed things and realised there were challenges that needed to be addressed.
Yes.
And then, is that when you started your review?
I suppose I identified there was, challenges prior to getting into that role, when I became more involved in the national, and I wanted to develop I wanted to enhance and change the programme, yes.
And improve it.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 23? You talk here about there was no quality assurance processes in place back then, so it was pretty difficult to establish what an officer would actually get trained in when they went back for their annual recertification programme. Would you explain to people what a quality assurance process is?
So, from a strictly training perspective, each training course obviously has to have an outcome, and that outcome has to be measurable, because if you don't have a measurable outcome, then you don't know if the training's been effective or not. So quality assurance is about ensuring that the training programme that's delivered is meeting the outcomes.
So it's checking that the outcomes are what you want them to be and that you're able to achieve them by taking certain steps.
Yes.
And there was national governance, sorry, you'll have to move down the page slightly. There was national governance in place for PTD. There was no quality assurance carried out back then. That didn't start until 2016. Once that was in place, we can be confident of what was delivered at refresher training. The refresher training is the recertification.
Yes.
So really it was only from 2016 when your new manual came in, you'd implemented your recommendations, that you could be confident that there was the standardisation and the quality assurance that you were seeking.
Yes.
But that's not something you can be confident about prior to that date.
No.
Okay. Can I look at paragraph 25, please? When I took over as OST coordinator and given a national remit, then my priority back then, first of all, was to minimise the risk posed by that, so that was to standardise the programme. It wasn't to enhance the programme or improve the programme. Back then, for my review, there was many forces had no lesson plans, no risk assessments, no training documentation, no standardisation or consistency. So my priority was to make sure that what was trained in Stranraer was the same as was trained in Aberdeen, and that took years to do. And that wasn't even my primary role. My primary role was the management of the OST team in the West Command. The secondary role was to standardise OST nationally, create a new programme, create all the ancillary documents, programme specifications, lesson plans, risk assessments, health and safety. So if we find examples of lesson plans or exam questions, or can I take it from that paragraph that they would not be nationally consistent across Scotland? Lesson plans in the period up to 2016 would be from legacy forces.
That's correct, yes.
And that would be individual forces teaching individual areas with instructors who weren't standardised or hadn't been trained in a standard way to students who were being taught by those individuals.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I look at the use of force SOP, please? And I think it's PERC 01342 or PS 10933. That was a statement, I think. This is it. We see it on the screen. Use of force standard operating procedure. And this date is published 26 August 2013. And the version is 1.03. I wonder if you can help us understand the interrelation between the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedure on use of force, and the 2013 manual, which we've looked at earlier, where there's use of force sections in it. And we've also seen in the PowerPoint there's reference to use of force. Trying to work out how they relate to each other.
So the training manual is that it's a source document used for training courses. The Standard Operating Procedure will cover policies and procedures to be undertaken and, you know, roundabout use of force. So you don't use a SOP for training purposes. You use that as your policy and document.
But is the information in the use of force SOP used to provide the training? Are they consistent with each other, I suppose, is the question I have.
They should be.
Yeah.
And they should support and inform each other. Yeah.
And we've heard other evidence that the SOPs are available on an intranet for officers.
Yes.
And we've also heard there are many, many SOPs.
Yes.
How important would you say the use of force SOP is to police officers when they're going about their daily work?
I mean, it was my area of business, and it's something I was very passionate about. So, for me, I would say it's you know, extremely important. Use of force is an area of policing that can be very, you know, emotive and very controversial, and has high risk. So, for me, it should be extremely important for officers to know the content of a use of force SOP.
And would I be correct in saying that when we look at the training that's given and what's in the manual, that there is an emphasis given to officers understanding use of force and justifications for that?
That's correct, yes.
Could we look at a couple of paragraphs or sections, 4.6 and 4.7? Thank you. So again, here we see 4.6, profiled offender behaviour. And this seems to mirror, to some extent, the title of one of the slides. And as we move down the page, we'll see that levels 1 to 6 should be there. Yes. So again, that was mirrored in the slide.
Yes.
And let's go back to the top, please, Miss Wildgoose. So this is the actual SOP, and it says this term encompasses the actions and behaviour of the subject and comprise of the warning and danger signs they exhibit, coupled with impact factors. Profiling a person's behaviour may assist in determining an officer's reasonable response, and it can be subcategorised. And again, 462, level 1 is compliance, where you've already explained it in relation to the slides. Most people dealt with are reasonable and will comply with any lawful instruction. And it may be verbal or it may be active compliance, such as stopping an action when told. And then level 2, 4.6.3, verbal resistance and or gestures. And again, this very much ties in with what you told us earlier. It normally includes non-verbal gestures and posturing or body language, and can consist of warning and danger signs of potential attack. So can you explain what that is? It's obviously verbal resistance and or gestures, and it contains warning and danger signs of potential attack. What does that mean?
So, warning and danger signs, human beings are pre-programmed, I suppose you want to call it that, from from primal days. We have a set of behaviours that are subconscious, and these behaviours can be exhibited when there is a conflict situation, when that individual is going through a fear process or anything like that. When a person is angry, aggressive, they will very often display what's known as warning signs. Warning signs are signs of what we call ritualised combat, and they are signs like, you know, it goes back to kind of animalistic type behaviours, where the person will use big hand gestures, and they'll grow themselves up tall, they'll raise their head to make themselves look more intimidating, and these are all subconscious behaviours. A danger sign is usually a precursor to an imminent attack, so that is when the body is preparing to attack, and that is when you'll see a discoloration of the face from darker to paler. You will see the chin going down to protect the softer areas of the throat. You will see fists getting clenched. You will see the body getting ready to attack. Very often, these are signs that can indicate that someone is ready to assault or attack another person.
Would this include someone clenching their fists?
Yes.
Would it include someone holding their palms outwards?
So normally holding their palms outwards is classed as a warning sign, because that's when that person is trying to make themselves bigger. Clenching of the fist, in my view, is normally a danger sign. That's when they're getting ready to attack.
This distinction with the palms out with a warning sign, would it matter if they were at the side of their body, or are you to make yourself bigger? I'm wondering if you can demonstrate what you mean.
Normally, again, say everything's different and it behaves differently. One of the warning signs that I'm aware of is when an individual will make big gestures. You know, they will put their hands up, make themselves look bigger. Hands go out to the side to make themselves more imposing or more intimidating. But what you can very quickly do is move, and people can go from danger sign to warning sign. And you'll tend to find that at times there could be an occasion when the hands were out, but then they'll start to come in
To their body.
to their body, because that is then them starting to reduce their own target profile, and it allows them to potentially for an attack.
So again, it's open to interpretation.
Absolutely, yes.
And then let's just finish off these last few ones. Level 3 is passive resistance. I think you explained that. And can we move on to 4 and 5? This is the active resistance and assaultive resistance. And then level 6, the serious aggravated assaultive resistance. So again, the SOP itself mirrors the information, the levels that were demonstrated in the slides, and also are present in the manual.
Yes, correct.
I'm conscious of the time.
Well, we'll stop for lunch at 2 o'clock.